we will now take a look at MSNBC's response to the announcement of JD Vance as Trump's vice president. Who do you think this helps, according to Rachel Maddow? Who do you think is very happy at this pick? So Rachel Maddow thinks
Hitler?
There's one person in the world. No, worse, even worse. It's even worse than that, Russell. Who is very happy at this pick? Let's hear from Rachel Maddow.
Vance, I think, widely considered to be the most radical choice.
Does not signal that Trump is trying to soften any edges. And the only person who was more excited than JD Vance this afternoon was Vladimir Putin.
Sorry, I forgot it was McCaskill
I am
who said
convinced
Putin,
that Claire McCaskill is the wolf from Little Red Riding Hood in disguise.
Yeah, exactly. It does look like that. The wolf dressed as the grandmother.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so I smeared Maddow by accident there. I forgot. It wasn't her that said Putin. It was McCaskill said Putin. Much apologies to Rachel Maddow.
And the only person who was more excited than JD Vance this afternoon was Vladimir Putin. They dropped balloons from the sky where Putin was hanging out this afternoon because JD Vance has even said he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine.
Oh, my.
Come closer, the better to see you, my dear.
So as we mentioned earlier in the stream, their opposition to Trump, the reason they fearmonger about Trump as much as they do is not because of what there is to legitimately fear about Trump, but it's what there is about Trump that appeals to that certain populism, which they will brand nationalism to try and make it sound as scary as they can. I'm not saying none of that's there, but the populism is what bothers them. Not the nationalism, not the xenophobia, none of that. It's the populism. It's the populism that has them very uneasy. And our friend Lee Fong, who we interviewed yesterday afternoon, just came out with a piece apparently last night about this very thing that, Russell, I guess you're going to read from.
Yes. Lee, as you will see in our interview tonight, he's one of the best investigative reporters around, and boom, he had this ready to go. A very interesting and fair article about JD Vance. He doesn't shy away from pointing out that he does have some very extreme conservative positions. But when in keeping with what we were saying about their issues with Trump, it's the same with JD Vance. The issues they have with JD Vance are probably the things that he's best on.
Can you believe he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine?
Can you believe he wants to have negotiations with Russia?
Can you?
Russia! I gotta say, as an Xer who remembers the Cold War, it's just amazing to me that we're back here again with Russia. We thought that was over. We thought that was over with the rehabilitation of the Russians in the movies. Right? The Russians became like our allies and friends, and we're back. Far from a partisan warrior, Vance has praised the most populist economic figures in the Biden administration, including Lena Khan, the Federal Trade Commission chair, who has led a push against Silicon Valley monopolies and private equity abuses. Vance has also said that Jared Bernstein, the head of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, known as an outspoken proponent of labor unions and middle-class policies, is, quote, one of the best people we could have gotten. He has spoken highly of the Biden administration's efforts to bring back semiconductor manufacturing, though he is sharply critical of the set-asides for diversity in the program. I got news for you. Most people don't like that. Not only white people, most people don't. Vance works well with a diverse set of lawmakers on Capitol Hill. He frequently co-sponsors corporate accountability legislation with Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Quote, we actually want to make change, Warren told Politico, remarking on her work with Vance to prevent executives from bailed out banks from reaping huge bonuses. His record shows a relatively high degree of cooperation with Senate Democrats, particularly on populist issues for enhancing oversight over corporations. And he's got some points here of some of what Vance has done in the Senate. Vance co-sponsored legislation with Senator Raphael Warnock, Warren, and Sanders to cap out-of-pocket expenses for insulin at $35 or 25% of a plan's negotiated price for Americans insured with private health insurance.
They've surrendered to the communists.
Yeah. It turns out he's right. Turns out Scarborough was right about something for once. Yeah. They have surrendered to the communists. Vance and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse introduced legislation that reshapes decades of corporate tax law, forcing corporate mergers of firms beyond $500 million in revenue to immediately pay capital gains taxes on shares earned through such deals. Now, I'm sorry, listen. If a Democratic Party that includes figures like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as well, ever pushed a policy like that, I'd eat my hat. They've been completely captured by Wall Street. I mean, frankly, it's not that the Republicans are salt of the earth, but it does demonstrate Vance showing some independence from that still entrenched Reaganomics establishment of his own party. And clearly the momentum in that party is shifting in that direction, whereas that's not the case with the Democrats. The agents that we sent into the Democrats to pull it in that direction, like AOC, they're running around trying to protect Biden as his brains leak out his ears.
Well, yeah, and to really drive that point home, it was AOC and the squad members who came up with that bullshit workaround amendment to the railroad bill that Joe Biden forced through when the railroad workers were striking. That's the one Ryan Grimm said was the thing they did at the behest of the railroad workers, when that was absolutely not the case. We interviewed the very railroad workers that he was talking about there.
Yes.
And so we know for a fact that he was wrong about that. And that AOC and the squad basically used that as an opportunity to show them, hey, superficially, look, we tried, knowing it was going to fail. Vance was one of only a very small handful of Republicans. I think it was only 8 Republicans. Like I said, I'm not trying to give the Republican Party credit here. He was one of a very small minority of Republicans who supported the sick leave that they were trying to get.
Right. Vance co-sponsored legislation with Senator Dick Durbin to require price transparency and Medicare coverage status on certain pharmaceutical advertisements. Vance has worked with Senator Sherrod Brown on legislation to tighten inspection requirements and hike penalties for rail cars carrying chemicals in response to the Norfolk Southern derailment disaster in East Palestine, Ohio last year. Vance co-sponsored Senator Tim Kaine's legislation to repeal the authorization of the use of military force in Iraq. I guess that's a symbolic gesture at this point, but okay. Vance and Senator Tammy Baldwin sponsored legislation to prevent the licensing of government-funded advanced technology to foreign corporations. The bill was sponsored in light of revelations that specialized battery technology developed had been licensed to a Chinese firm. Vance was one of the first modern Republicans to walk the picket lines in support of the United Auto Worker union strike for higher wages and benefits last year. He has repeatedly savaged the neoconservatism establishment, claiming that they have entrenched America in unwinnable forever wars that serve no strategic interest for the country. Vance's calls for peace negotiations with Ukraine place him far from the center of the D.C. establishment and closer to the fringes of both parties. Over the last 2 years, it has only been the House Progressive Caucus and House Freedom Caucus, along with a few mavericks in the Senate, such as Vance, who have openly demanded talks with Russia to end the war. Speaking to American Compass last year, Vance explained his belief that market forces have failed the American family and that policymakers should consider tax penalties for corporations that ship jobs overseas and subsidies for businesses that restore the nation's manufacturing base. During the discussion, Vance scorned the market-based incentives that drive the nation's best neuroscientists to seek lucrative jobs by making, quote, highly addictive predictive algorithms for Facebook rather than helping to produce a cure for Alzheimer's, and the best mathematicians to work for quantitative hedge funds rather than developing next-generation fission energy. Now that is some MAGA communism right there. Like, that is discussing an intervention in the marketplace that you haven't heard from Republicans maybe ever, even before they went where they are now. Quote, the traditional free market response to this is, well, clearly this is what people value more if they're willing to pay 3 times as much, noted Vance. Instead, he said he favors more economic intervention, an industrial policy that recognizes where we need to direct our country's resources to solving real problems. Some of his anti-monopolist overtures have been beyond the limelight and carefully crafted to impact power. Earlier this year, he filed an amicus brief into an Ohio case to classify Google as a common carrier utility. This designation would open the company up to much more stringent regulations and penalties over free speech concerns. That would be amazing, because if you notice, if you've been in this space for a long time, when you Google for news articles, you remember you used to get Common Dreams, you used to get Sheer Post, you don't anymore. You have to, maybe in the sixth page of the search, you can find that now. In the Senate, he said he has heard the same tired slogans justifying the escalation of the Ukraine war, positioning it as a conflict about democracy versus tyranny, the same arguments that were made for the Middle East wars of the War on Terror era. Quote, I do not think it is in America's interest to continue to fund an effectively never-ending war in Ukraine. During the speech, he also argued that the old thinking of the party came from its leadership, calling out Senator Mitch McConnell, who he said has been wrong about nearly every foreign position he's held since his election in 1984, the year of Vance's birth. Vance also argued that the trade policies of the old Republican establishment, centered around offshoring American manufacturing to maximize corporate profits, had weakened America, making it reliant on its enemies and unable to make medicine or munitions. Quote, the neoconservative approach to China is sort of the dumbest of all possible solutions. They want the Chinese to manufacture all of our stuff, and they also want to go to war with China. It's a good point.
They've surrendered to the communists.
See? None of this suggests Vance is a liberal or a progressive. He has supported a harsh crackdown on student protests on college campuses and declined to sponsor legislation that would even the playing field for workers attempting to organize labor unions. He has said he supports Medicare negotiating for lower drug prices and efforts to import cheaper prescription drugs, but has not signed onto any legislation to make these promises a reality. So, hey, yeah, supposedly he's moderating his position on abortion. He had a very extreme, the most extreme position on abortion. So not to say this guy's the second coming of FDR. There's a reason he's in the Republican Party. But does he represent a major shift in the direction of what Trump's 2016 campaign purported to represent, but did not follow through with legislatively? Certainly. And as you point out, Trump is making a big statement, especially given that he can only serve one more term, about the direction he wants the party to go in.
Yes, well, that's what makes this such an innovation, because he's only there for 4 more years, which means now JD Vance is essentially maybe not the presumptive nominee, but just about as close to the presumptive nominee as you can get for 2028. He is going to be running as Trump's second term, if you will.
Right.
And the fact that he went in this direction with a candidate like that shows that there is some sort of prudential wisdom. You know, this is the thing I never really understood about the Democrats. This is what makes them just so impossibly stupid at the end of the day is, look, whatever your ideology is, when you see material conditions, right, to be really communist, to go full MAGA communist about this, when you see material conditions evolving, don't you realize that for the sake of maintaining power, for the sake of actually staying in power and being in the driver's seat when it comes to steering policy, you have to give a little bit of that ideology up. Like, now that the Republicans are taking in working class voters and voters from all over the world, in terms of like, a lot of the immigrants who are coming here are voting GOP now, right? As you're getting more diverse from both a nationality perspective and a class perspective, you're going to have to, if you want that to stick, you're going to have to tweak those policy dials to accommodate these new voters. Whereas the Democrats just don't. It's the same thing over and over again. We think climate change is real. They don't. We believe in a woman's right to choose. They don't. Right? We're for gay marriage. They're not. At this point, I don't even know how true that is. I think most Republicans are pretty much resigned to that at this point. But the point is, irrespective of what you feel about the merits of those views, there's no willingness to actually change. That's why all Biden can do at the debate, assuming he had his faculties about him, was try to nail him on January 6th, try to tell him how ashamed of himself he should be for saying that the veterans were suckers and losers. What are you talking? You're not talking about anything that has to do with anybody's lives here. And they are willing to make pivots in that direction. And I say pivots instead of moves because time will tell how they actually move on these things. Right? I mean, Trump ran a very populist campaign in 2016.
He did.
He governed like Mitt Romney, who shook, Putin's hand, basically.
Right.
That's what we got. So time will tell. And obviously, on the Israel issue, as you could see on the campus speech, horrible. That whole issue, horrible. They're all horrible. Every candidate from every party that's viable this year is horrible on that issue. And that's horrible, but that is what it is. If we're analyzing the wisdom of this as a political choice, you have to look at a willingness to redefine the party, to grab the party by the horns, as Donald Trump has done in naming JD Vance his successor. He is empowering what is still ultimately, numbers-wise, a minority faction amongst elected Republicans. Only 8 Republicans, I believe that's the number, 8 supported the sick leave for the railroad workers, and Vance was one of them, right? So the easy thing to do would have been to pick a Rubio or a Scott. I mean, that's the easy way. This is the hard way. But I want to play a piece of video here. We're going to talk about Teamsters President Sean O'Brien's speech to the RNC in the next segment. But here he is talking to Fox News about JD Vance.
I mean, JD Vance, the short time that we've worked together, I mean, he's been great on Teamster issues. He has co-sponsored an airline manufacturing bill that addresses outsourcing of critical airline maintenance to China. He's also supported paid sick leave for our railroad workers. If you remember that situation a couple of years ago, where they weren't getting sick time, he stepped right up. He's also been very vocal and supportive of holding employers accountable who try and skirt their obligation under an independent contractor model known as DSP. So he's been right there on all our issues. We've publicly stated it. And look, at this day and age, there's nothing better than having a U.S. Marine represented as a vice president candidate.
Okay, so look at the conversation. Look at the difference in conversation between what's happening on Fox News and what's happening on MSNBC. Fox News, this guy's talking about, well, he, has, stuck up for workers. He tried to crack down on employers who were taking advantage of, some independent contractor stipulation. They're talking about issues that affects ordinary people there. On MSNBC, what do we hear?
Trump is trying to soften any edges. And the only person who was more excited than JD Vance this afternoon was Vladimir Putin.
Right. So on MSNBC, on the supposedly left-wing network, they're talking about how, well, Putin's really happy, he doesn't care about Ukraine. And on the right-wing network, they have the Teamsters president saying how JD Vance stood up for workers and how they're happy with his record. That shows you the realignment that is taking place and how the selection of Vance as the successor of the MAGA movement is an acknowledgement of that. And like I said, does it go any further than that? Time will tell. Time will tell. Never give a politician credit for anything until they earn it. And as far as I could see, time will tell whether he earns it or not. But that is a gesture in that direction. There's no denying that.
You could not pick two better clips to demonstrate how much the party's rhetoric, at the very least, have inverted. Because this were 1968 and black and white, and somebody just showed you those clips, and they said, which party are each of these people from? You would have said McCaskill was the Republican, and the other network would have represented the Democrats.
Exactly.
Here they are. They're talking about labor issues and unions, and they're red baiting over here.
Exactly. Right.
This is a politics for people who can afford a politics of aesthetic gestures, who don't have dire material needs that they desperately want politicians to fix. That is a politics for people who can afford their politics to be about virtue signaling on Facebook and increasingly ginning up crazed conspiracy theories on the internet about assassinations being staged, as has been remarkable. Mehdi Hassan, look, we're not Mehdi Hassan fans here, but he is the first mainstream journalist I've seen put Blue MAGA in a headline. He just wrote a whole op-ed in The Guardian about Blue MAGA, about how they've become the very cultish, closed-minded, conspiratorial people that they claim to be against.
Wow. He's going to lose some subscribers over that.
Oh, yeah.
I'd love to read the comment section on that article. Wow.
Please clap.